In a democracy, citizens need to be informed. Informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. Black Lives Matter is a global movement originating in the African American community. This organization campaigns against violence and systematic racism towards black people. Dawn Motkins is the co-founder of the Long Beach chapter of this organization, and she is here to discuss what they are doing to advance their mission in the city of Long Beach. Welcome to our program, Ms. Motkins.
Thank you, Erroll.
Black Lives Matter is a very provocative organization, and today we want to discuss with you what are you guys trying to do on a global basis as well as a national and regional and city basis? What are you guys trying to accomplish?
That's a big question. Global, national, and on a city basis. So as you know, or may not know, some viewers may or may not know, Black Lives Matter was born out of justice for Trayvon Martin. After Trayvon was murdered by vigilante.
Police?
No, George Zimmerman.
Yes.
Right, not
yes.
police.
No,
Maybe in his
George
mind
Zimmerman,
he thought he was the police.
Yes.
After his the murder of Trayvon, and then shortly after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, and just the how moved communities were across our country after feeling like for sure this guy is going to be held accountable for this. That 911 officer told him to fall back, and he took it upon himself to hunt Trayvon down and murdered him, and we all know that story. And so it was birthed out of that, literally as a hashtag on picket signs for justice for Trayvon Martin, hashtagged Black Lives Matter. And so, a few folks got together here in LA, Patrice Cullors, Melina Abdullah, a number of folks who had been doing some organizing work here in LA, and many who had not, just out of pure frustration and a need to feel like we have got to do something different, took the initiative to do that and birthed Black Lives Matter, and literally took to the streets to raise enormous awareness around this being a devastating harm on our children, on our black community, on our families. And so we've been carrying out that work since then, nationally and globally and locally.
One of the unique things about your organization is it's not one charismatic leader that we can point to, like in days of old, Martin Luther King or Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X. It's a unit where the concept seems to be the primary thing that you're trying to do. Is that correct?
That is correct, right? No one person can carry the extent of work that it's going to take to begin to really hold these powers accountable, right? And I don't think we want there to be one person. This is a leaderful movement where everyone has a place, everyone has a lane, and it's going to take that broad level of, personal leadership by everyone to make change.
So each chapter is kind of sovereign, although the concept is a common denominator in terms of stop police violence against black people. So your chapter here in Long Beach, tell us some of the things that you're trying to do with the Long Beach Police Department and the black community.
Sure. So there's a guiding set of principles that we're at about 35 chapters across the nation. We're kind of gelled by these sets of guiding principles that we all are in agreement under and kind of live by.
Give us a couple of examples of those principles.
Sure. I would love to pull them up for you so I can give them to you exactly. Let's see.
Of course, we know it's police brutality is one of the things that.
Well, yeah, it's a little more.
And murder.
It's a little more these sets of principles. One moment.
And how long have you been involved with the Long Beach chapter? I mean, you co-founded the Long Beach chapter.
Yeah. So we started our chapter here in Long Beach probably right after a massive caravan that left from LA to Ferguson. So the end of 2014, the end of that summer, a few of us began to talk about, what can we do here in Long Beach? It was just that year later that Long Beach police, in 2015, murdered 15 people, killed 15 people unarmed. So we knew that that was something that we had to do in our own backyard.
Of those 15 people that were murdered, how many were African American? How many were Latino? What other races might have been involved in
It was mixed.
It was mixed.
It was mixed.
Predominantly African American, though?
Let's see. Tyler Woods, Dante Jordan, Faraz Marad, who I think may have been, he was brown. Most of these men were brown. Jason Consenti, Barry Prack, Noel Aguilar, Hector Morejon.
So most of them were Latino?
Brown. I don't think Jason was brown. Barry Prack was, he might have been Cambodian, I think.
I see.
So not all black. So this isn't,
Okay.
While we center Black lives and, make sure that the systems and institutions that we have to work around and work within are, holding them accountable for its anti-blackness, right? That's just what that means. That doesn't mean that. Let me just pause for a second because I'm reflecting on the principles and I want to
go right ahead.
pull them up
While
for
you're
you.
finding the principles, but there seems to be what you're saying also is a systematic way the police confront people in the community, not only black people but anyone. It seems that you are in odds about how police departments in metropolitan cities approach citizens in terms of any conflict.
It's a little bit bigger than that. I'll give it to you. Can I go ahead and share with you the principles?
You can go right and read it.
So this is what kind of gels our network across the globe.
Okay.
So not just nationally, we have networks who have been building in Brazil, in Canada, in the UK,
Global.
in Australia, right? So while we're gelled by these sets of principles that keeps us in relationship and allows us to be in loving accountability with one another,
Yes.
making sure that there aren't folks who are out doing the type of work that might be against what our intended focus for this network was.
That's right.
There's still a level of autonomy for each of our chapters and our networks around the world and our chapters across the nation to be able to tend to and address the very often unique types of issues that are coming up in folks' own immediate communities. So the sets of principles that we operate under, we're committed to acknowledging, respecting, and celebrating differences. We are committed to collectively, lovingly, and courageously working vigorously for freedom and justice for Black people, and by extension, all people. As we forge our path, we intentionally build and nurture a beloved community that is bonded together through beautiful struggle that is restorative and not depleting. We are unapologetically Black in our positioning. In affirming that Black lives matter, we need not qualify our position. To love and desire freedom and justice for ourselves is a necessary prerequisite for wanting the same for others. We see ourselves as a part of a global Black family that are aware of the different ways we are impacted or privileged as Black folks who exist in different parts of the world. So these are the types of, I know we have limited time, I don't want to spend it walking through all these. There are about 10, 12, 13 of them. But those are the types of commitments and principles that we are committed to with one another.
Now, one of the things that people are critical of Black Lives Matter is that they're confrontational politics or they're confrontational tactics that they use. Does that bother you in any way? You are for nonviolence, you do not support violence, but you do confront powers that be about the treatment of citizens in the community.
Confrontational? Define confrontational.
Well, you're speaking to power in maybe not so much a nice way. They've committed certain wrongs to citizens in the community, but you are not being very diplomatic. You're confronting them with rhetoric or sit-ins or whatever else you do. Would that be correct?
Yeah. It's interesting. I don't necessarily usually have these types of conversations. It's just interesting to me that it
How would you
the
just,
term, the term confrontational, right?
Okay.
Doesn't it sound awfully confrontational,
Yes,
right? And
it does.
I think the way that I like to look at it is there's some moments in time, there's some experiences. There comes a time after a series of attempts of seeking freedom
that's right.
that if it isn't moving, right, or if the veil of white supremacy is so stark and strong that we have been having sit-ins and conversations and negotiating over our freedom for hundreds of years, at some point, similar to our civil rights movement, right? At some point, it might require a little bit of disruption of those systems that are continuing to
apologize
inflict
for
those
that. No,
harms.
I'm not suggesting you
Not at
apologize.
all, right?
Right.
Like those sit-ins when our I want to say ancestors, not all of them are ancestors yet, right? But for our elders who were told that you're not supposed to be in that restaurant, or you're not supposed to be in that neighborhood or drink from that water fountain. Did folks think that was confrontational back then, to go and drink at that fountain anyway?
Absolutely,
to go
yes.
and take a seat at that restaurant and have a burger, right?
Sure.
So it's the same, right? I don't know, confrontational, folks can call it whatever they like, frankly, right? But it's an intentional civil disobedience. It's an intentional disruption of a system that is constantly harming Black lives and disrupting our lives, right? And so it needs to be disrupted.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about what you're trying to do in Long Beach. You have confronted the Long Beach, I'm using the word again, but
Sure.
with the Long Beach Police Department, and you're at odds with them in terms of how they deal with the mentally ill, and people have mental challenges. Explain what you're trying to do with that. And you were just in front of the City Council trying to present a proposal with that. Explain
Sure.
that.
Sure. I'm from Long Beach. Been here from LA, Compton, since I was about 8 years old. Went to Lafayette, went to Los Cerritos, Jefferson, Wilson, Lakewood, and have had my own share of observations and experience of our police department here. Long Beach PD has a history of abuse. Just now I was trying to think of his name in Signal Hill.
Ron Settles.
Ron Settles, right? There are a number of incidences. I don't want to try to call those names in from that far back. They're all not going to come to me. But that abuse has been in existence. And so, but to come more current in this movement of Black lives and folks finding their voice and being willing to call out these harms and call out this abuse, what we're noticing is it isn't just necessarily about the Long Beach Police Department. We live in a city where it looks like the Long Beach Police Department is more of a tool. It's more of a tool that is used by this city to maintain its control, to gain and manage powers that it's trying to maintain. Some may even argue part of that is a maintenance of white supremacy that exists in our city. And so we have to be thoughtful about how we disrupt this status quo of this maintenance of power that excludes Black community. That includes gentrification, that includes how we deal with mental illness, that includes how we're policing our youth, how we are funding and contracting Long Beach Police with our Long Beach Unified School District, which is tough. I have friends who are school psychologists who are telling me that they can only get part-time work or being laid off because of budget cuts or other reasons why Long Beach Unified School District isn't funding school psychologists and counselors and staffing them at levels that it used to be. But on the other hand, can afford, $1 million contracts with Long Beach Police, who are seeking to, it's not that relationship that our counselors and psychologists have with our children in order to help prevent these school shootings, for example, right? But instead, intimidating and threatening and often harassing students who are being kids type situations. It's harmful.
So you're talking about that the city of Long Beach should reallocate their budget priorities in terms of addressing this issue of mental illness and the police department in some ways.
Right.
Correct?
So city of Long Beach has what, about a $3 billion budget. Over half of our city's budget goes to the police. And when I think about where these resources are going, and I'm thinking about, and I have to say these names, they're coming to me in this moment: Dante Jordan, Tyler Woods, Hector Morejon, Noel Aguilar, Faraz Maraj, Jason Consenti, Barry Pratt, Lionel Gibson. There's a woman, Cindy Tomlins, right, a police officer, rammed her car chasing her and killed her as a result. And between these, not only direct violence by the police department, but also other forms of violence committed against particularly people who were naming and calling out their abuses. And I'm thinking of Cesar Rodriguez, who was not murdered by them, but certainly retaliated against by them when he named their abuses. We're spending millions of dollars on their abuse. How many years ago, 2 years ago or so, we pushed to raise, I don't know, 30 million or so in sales tax revenue. We've spent more than that in lawsuits. They're in federal court now behind chasing the young man, I had to jot his name down, Cesar Rodriguez, on the Blue Line last year. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
They're in federal court now behind that. There's a Citizens Police Complaint Commission that is this facade of a place for citizens to go to say, hey, I had an issue with this officer. He assaulted me in some kind of way. Or when people bring these concerns directly to the police, it's this commission that's supposed to help to hold police accountable, right? But they don't. And most folks who are aware of the CPCC know it. More folks actually don't even know that they exist. And there was a commissioner, I'm trying to think of his name, Thomas Gonzalez, I think, who said, look, you're not even bringing the cases to us. And they're hearing about them in other ways. And the cases you are bringing to us, they're being directed by the city manager, by folks who are positioned by the city manager and under the direction of Pat West. Saying we're aware of these certain harms that have been committed. We're aware of how this particular murder happened when you shot Tyler Woods in the back over 20 times, right? We're aware of what really took place, and we're aware of how you're trying to manipulate these reports to say otherwise. And it's our job as commissioners to really work through what this accountability process needs to look like, right? And then you have folks like the Police Officers Association coming in, right, the city attorney coming in trying to balance this out. And what ended up happening is that they felt exposed, similar to how they got exposed for using tiger text, for committing a violation possibly of Penal Code Section 135 that says that they should not be destroying or concealing evidence, right? And their internal affairs investigators and homicide investigators have been. But this guy said, look, bring these cases to us as you should. They drugged that man through the dirt. And he sued them, and he just won $736,000. They are wasting our money. You mentioned mental health. I'll give you this quick story. Is that okay?
Yes, go right ahead.
Our mental health community, Long Beach is finally in a place, has been in a place to at least be attempting to have real conversations about how to tend to our homeless community and our mental health community. And it doesn't feel realistic, right? One of our councilmen, and I'm gonna say Al Austin because it was public, it was right on Facebook, seemed excited to announce how he swept out the belongings of some homeless families here in North Long Beach. I forget, next to the one of the railroad companies. And there were some comments on his page about it. And so the attempt to really tend to really address how we tend to those needs doesn't feel genuine. And my concern, based on how police are tending to respond to our mental ill community, is because they're trained to kill, is to show up intimidating and violently and antagonistic and in threatening manners that exacerbate situations that our folks who are going through a psychotic episode are experiencing. The story, we work with so many different organizations throughout Long Beach, including in the faith community. And one of our folks at a church gave us a call and said a man who looked disheveled, looked really homeless, he was talking to himself, clearly seemed to be having a psychotic episode. He came in and he kind of spooked her. She's white. He kind of spooked her, because she's like, how did he get in our administrative offices, And so he got in there and he's mumbling and she's like, getting over her initial immediate fear or not fear, but her surprise, and offered him some water. Are you hungry? What do you need? What's up? Right? What can we do for you? And continued to mumble, and she stood up to get a little closer to him, and he attempted to touch her behind. And she said, from his demeanor, and he seemed a little, maybe possibly disabled, right? She said, I could have walked fast and gotten away from him. Like, I was not fearful for my life. And I refused to call the Long Beach Police Department because this person isn't clearly in need of some mental support. And we called around to the different health agencies, and all of them, our health department, our mental health department, Access, another mental health support program, all are directed to refer people to the Long Beach Police Department. What do they have that our experts, we are full of community experts, our community psychologists, child psychologists, clinical psychologists, correctional psychologists.
So you're thinking that they should probably in some cases be the first responder to that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Instead of the police department?
Absolutely,
okay.
Right? Like they paid $60,000 a year over at Cal State Long Beach to be these experts, right?
Now, you were just went to a city council meeting and presented your proposal to do that. Is this the kind of things that you're trying to do in the city of Long Beach, at least with the police department, in terms of changing that policy or philosophy in first responders?
Yeah, I think that's one of them. I think given the, there's an economic detriment that this police department is causing the city. They're costing us a lot of money. It feels like they're becoming more of a liability than an asset. And we're over-policed. You saw the recent article about the Blue Line where I had to jot this down to Long Beach only. I'm going to answer your question. Long Beach only, they were granted about, there was a $646 million fund, and Long Beach received part of that with LAPD and LA County Sheriff. And they only patrol 4 miles and only 8 stations. There's a total of 98 miles of station and 93 stations, 98 miles of rail and 93 stations. Their number of arrests, 1,450 arrests, were over half. There were only about 2,000 people total arrested on all of our rails of 93 stations, and they only have 8. And they had 1,450 arrests and a murder, right? So I think the over-policing, the cost with these lawsuits, and the harm and violence that they're committing on our community, the distrust, the use of tiger text, destroying information, the Fred Taft family, Fred Taft, rest his spirit. In fact, this weekend we're having a gathering for him at Pan American Park at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, that was the African-American gentleman that was shot by someone that they have not arrested
It's
yet.
believed to have been a white supremacist.
Yes.
The family and community have been organizing, held its own community investigation, its own, putting out notices for a reward that community and the family had to organize around to get the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors to offer their reward, because Long Beach said that's not what they do. This is an area where Fred Taft was murdered, where it is well known, a lot of law enforcement officers live in this Lakewood Village area, okay, at Pan Am Park, right at Centralia in between Bellflower and Clark Streets. A lot of sheriff, judges, prosecutors, Long Beach officers, and LAPD, and the attention that the police have been putting on this case of this black man that was killed by what looks like a hate crime.
Yes.
right? And so based on witness testimony and some other testimony by the community about the amount of hate that exists in that area and racism that exists in that area, the police have seemed hands off. They've mishandled this case in a number of ways. I think the family will come out more about that at another time. But because of this extent of harm and distrust that this department has brought to our community, yes, we've presented them with a set of demands at City Council. And one of those demands is to say, Pat West, you probably need to go. It's time for you to go. Well, Chief Luna?
We're out of time
right
now. Maybe at another time we can come and continue that discussion, but what your organization is doing is something that is very different in the city, and is provocative, and we will see how all this plays out. Now, when is the next time you guys really quick go into the City Council to follow up on this proposal?
All of our information when we have our public actions or attending City Council or events like supporting the Fred Taft family or Dante Jordan, this is his 5-year his Angelversary will be at Seaside Park on November 10th. And all that information will be on our Facebook page, on Twitter, and that's where people can find information for where we'll be next.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Don Motkins, for your explanation of your organization, and we look forward to seeing some of the things that you're guys trying to do in the city of Long Beach.
Thank you.
That was Don Motkins, who is the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter organization, and visiting us on Conversations with Erroll Parker. We'll be back next week with more exciting guests. Good night. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. Sahai S.E.B. Farrell is the author of a thrilling, poignant spiritual novel in part about her experiences with former Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie and his family. She is here to discuss her book that takes you back and brings you forward in a very fascinating journey. Welcome to the program, Sahai.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Erroll.
It's been a long time. Over 30 years ago, you were on one of my programs, and we were talking about, what was the subject?
It was my workshop and book called Thru, The Transformation of Race, Resolving the Internal Dilemmas.
Okay, you remember that.
I do.
But this is a different book,
yes.
Sahai.
Yes.
Give us a brief synopsis of this book.
So this book is really two parallel love stories. It's historical fiction, and one is a modern day love story that takes place between a young woman from Watts and one of the Emperor Haile Selassie's grandsons. And the other one is the beginning of the lineage of kings in Ethiopia, which is the son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. And so it's their son, Menelik, was the first king of Ethiopia. So really you have two love stories, one at the beginning of the reign of kings in Ethiopia and one at the end of the reign of kings. So you just kind of get to see that even though it's thousands of years, there are common things in love, you know, common things in history, common spiritual things that go on.
What's the significance of this book?
I think it's here in the subtitle. The title of the book is Woven into the Fabric, but the subtitle is Into the Very Fabric of Our Lives, God has woven spun gold. And so that just says there are things that we experience in life, people, ideas, places that are a part of the eternal fabric of life. They're timeless. They're eternal. And so for people to, encouraging people to listen for those things, to look for those things and those people in their lives and to treat them like they are spun gold, like they're as precious as they are. So.
Why a fiction novel? Because this is historical fact, most of it.
Yes.
Well, why did you decide to write a fiction novel?
Well, it wasn't exactly a decision of mine like that. So I remember listening to Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and other authors over the years. When I was at Stanford, I was an English major, so you end up reading thousands of novels. And many writers, especially my favorite ones, kind of say that if you're lucky, at some point, the book starts writing itself. The characters start having their own opinions, their own words. Like, you're not telling them what to say, they're telling you. And so
That's interesting.
it is. And so I always thought in the back of my mind, that's very fascinating. So as I was writing this book, the second year I was writing it, I was at the beach and I had finished writing for the morning. And I was sitting there and I heard a voice, and the voice said, "I am with the Creator from the beginning. I am given patterns and sets of living strings. I am destiny, the weaver." I said, that sounds fascinating. So I wrote it down. And little did I know, like a few days later when I was writing again, I was writing just my, it was a memoir. It started off as my story, just a memoir of meeting the emperor and how all that went. And, but when I started writing, so it was a first person narrative. I did this, I felt that. So when I started writing it after that voice, I was calling myself she. And I was thinking, why am I referring to myself in the third person? And so then, but I had taken a writing workshop with the wonderful author Dina Metzger. And she had said to us, and I had taken it to heart, that strange things might happen in the process of writing your book, but you just need to trust the process. So now that I cannot write I anymore, that I have to call myself she, this was one of those strange things. So I said, but trust the process. So it says, let me just let this play out and see how this writing in the third person is going to work. So I just allowed it to happen. And maybe months later, I realized, because I couldn't tell who is the narrator, but once that third person narrator took over, that is when the Queen of Sheba, as a young woman, just before her coronation as the Queen of Sheba, she came into the story. So that's exactly how she got in. And I'm trying to figure out, as the writer, who is this? And it wasn't until her mother and father said her name, Makeda, that I said, oh, that's the young Queen of Sheba. Okay, we're on a journey here. So that's how I felt as a writer. I'm on a journey here. And so I realized maybe within a year that Destiny was now the weaver of this story. And I said, okay, so Destiny is the narrator of the story.
Let's digress for a minute. You were Miss Watts 1968?
1971.
1971. And that catapulted you, the people organizing the event, that catapulted you in meeting Haile Selassie. Tell us about that encounter.
It did. So let me just backtrack just a little bit, because this is also a spiritual tale, like in reality a spiritual tale as well. Because I remember my freshman year at Stanford, I'm walking across campus. There's a huge church on campus called Memorial Church, and it has a mural at the top of the church when you're, just on the outside, and the sky in the mural is gold. So I'm walking across campus one day, and the sun, it's in the middle of the day, the sun hits the mural, and it kind of like makes me glint like that for a second. But as soon as I do that, I hear a voice, and it says, "You're going to Africa."
Just like that?
Just like that. And it was like, whoa. But it felt like I was going to Africa. And even though I was just 17, I was kind of always a spiritual person. So I kind of knew that voice, and I kind of knew that when I heard from that particular voice, that it was probably the truth. And I also knew that I didn't really have to know how yet. And so my boyfriend at school, I told him about it. He said, okay, we need a plan. So this is our freshman year, so our sophomore year we'll take a year of Italian. Then our junior year we'll go to Stanford in Italy, and they're cheap flights from Florence, Italy to Sierra Leone. So I just kind of quickly prayed and said, is that it? I didn't get an answer, and he was so happy about it and excited. I said, okay, let's do it. So we took a year of Italian, but when it came time to go, when I prayed about it, it came back no, so I didn't go. But
so you were following the voice.
I was following the voice, just following the guidance. It was like, okay. So now he's there. This is now the late spring of our junior year. He's there. He's, in fact, in Sierra Leone, just like he planned. And it's so funny because now we've lived all these years, and that's the kind of person he turned out to be, the one that plans his life, and he actually done all the things that he said he would. And so he sent me gifts, this African fabric and these African pictures, you know, when he was there. And so I'm dressing up in all this African fabric and prancing around, having fun. And then I thought about, why don't I feel bad? Because he's there, I'm not. And it just felt like, well, that just feels like it's not my trip. And so when I folded the stuff up finally, that voice that I heard 2 years before came back and said, exactly the same way, you're going to Africa. But it added, soon. So I said, soon? Hadn't connected anything, but a few months later I was at this post office on campus, and the woman who works in the post office says, you know, we got a letter here. I think it's for you, but it's kind of your name is spelled wrong. I said, yeah, everybody spells my name wrong. And I said, well, let me look. I said, is it from LA? Yeah. I said, it's probably for me. If it's not, I'll bring it back. And it was a strange letter because it was from a woman, Mrs. Johnson, very common name. And she said, you don't know me, but I've been, you know, you went to Fremont. I saw articles about you getting scholarships at Stanford. And, you know, your family was from Watts. I think you'd be a good Miss Watts. And she sent me an application for Miss Watts. So I prayed about it, and it just said, yeah. And
you wound up winning.
I wound up winning, but had no idea, because one of my older sisters, I had 3 older sisters, had been a Miss Watts, the second Miss Watts.
That's right.
So I had a up close, you know, Miss Watts was community service. And Miss Watts she went to New Orleans, and she went to San Francisco and San Diego, but mainly it's community service. And so that's when I agreed to run, because of this strange, you know, woman sending me the application. That's like, okay, so I can do this. I can do this for the years, like feeling like community service. But once I got involved in the pageant, you know, it was 2 weeks before the pageant until they announced the prize for Miss Watts, and they said, and the grand prize for Miss Watts is an all-expense paid trip to 5 African countries as the guest of the heads of state. So that was Haile Selassie, Jomo Kenyatta, Nyerere, Gowon, and Ashampong at the time.
How fascinating.
How fast. And it was like, soon as they said that, because it was late at night when she announced it, the voice came back and said, that's your trip. And so I knew I was going to win, because that was my trip.
Well, tell us about meeting with Haile Selassie.
So when I got there, and I just wanted to mention, when I asked about, oh my God, all these fancy things on my itinerary, I don't have clothes. I'm a senior in college. And she turned the program. Disneyland's costume department is making your wardrobe for the trip. So everything was
falling
fine.
in place.
So now I go, and we're at the Jubilee Palace, which is a true palace. I never thought about palaces in Africa, but here we were. And I had 2 companions traveling with me. And so we went in, and Dr. Talbert was teaching us the protocol for meeting the emperor. So we were curtsying and called him Your Majesty, and all these things. And so they came to get us. But when the guard came to get me to have audience, they said, you know, His Majesty would like to see Miss Hayes, which is my maiden name, alone first. And I said, Dr. Talbert? And he said, go ahead. So I went, and there he was. You walk into this huge room, and there's a throne. And there he is. And
did you have to pinch yourself, say, this is really happening to
it was
me?
like, I'm just walking, and I'm just trying to really, what was on my mind is, don't mess up your curtsy. That was really what was on my mind. Don't be awkward. Don't be awkward. So, you know, I did my little curtsy, and then, you know, he laughed. And just as I was about to curtsy, he extended a hand. So, you know, we were both trying to accommodate each other. So we started talking, and then he had someone bring me a chair. So he sat on his throne, I sat in the chair. And it just felt like it was an odd feeling, because it felt like I knew him. I knew I'd never met him, but spiritually it just felt like, I know you. And we were laughing and talking, just having a wonderful time. But there was a point in the conversation, he said, so, Miss Hayes, where are your people from? I said, Texas, Arkansas. He said, no, I mean, where in Africa are your people from? And I said, well, Your Majesty, you know, with slavery and everything, we don't really know where we are.
And how did he take that? Well, hold your point. We got to take a break.
Okay.
I want to know how he responded to that. And
Yes.
I'm sure he responded in a very interesting way.
Yes, he
We'll be
did.
right back with Sahai S.E.B. Hayes, who is the author of a book called Woven in Fabric, right after these messages.
Okay.
In a democracy, citizens need to be informed. Informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. We are visiting with Sahai S.E.B. Farrell, not Hayes, and she's the author of a book called Woven into the Fabric. And she was just talking about, we were digressing a minute, but we were just talking about her meeting with the great emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. And he asked you a question where your folks were from, and you
Right.
said Arkansas in the South.
Texas, yeah.
And he says, no, what part of Africa? So,
Yes.
so tell us about that.
So then I said, I felt a little uncomfortable, a little embarrassed that we didn't know where we're from. But I just said, well, just tell him the truth. I said, you know, Your Majesty, with slavery and everything, you know, we don't really know where we're from. I mean, I don't know. And he says, Miss Hayes, I know where you're from. And I said, where? And he just looked me direct and he said, you're from the royal lineage of the house of Judah, from my house. And I know my own anywhere. And I just I was 21. It just like my mind just said, pew.
Wow.
I mean, and in an odd way, it felt it was true, but I didn't know how it was true. And then he just said, and we just have to make the adjustment. And he sit back in his throne like that. And I said, I wonder what all this means. And so at some point, we talked for about an hour, and then I remembered my companions. I said, Your Majesty, and they brought them in. So at the end, he gave me a bracelet, and it had the first I've ever heard of spun gold. It was spun gold, braided with giraffe tail hair, and then it had the Ethiopian crown on it and a seal. And so what I didn't know at the time was that's a bracelet worn, he wears one, and worn by the royal family. And so I didn't know he had given me that. And I mean, I knew he'd give me that, but I didn't know the significance of it. And so he gave my companions, I had 2 companions, a cross. And then as we were leaving, he called me, we got to the door and he called me back, you know, Miss Hayes, come back. And I came back and he said, I have a surprise for you. And I said, but Your Majesty, the bracelet and all the things you've done for me. He says, no, someone to meet. And I said, yeah. And he said, yeah. He said, you'll get a new itinerary in the morning. He said, you'll like them. I said, well, Your Majesty, I like you so much, I know. He said, no, you have to come back and give me a report. And I said, I will. So when we got the new itineraries in the morning, we had about 4 more days there. And so it was 2 different envelopes. One was for me, one for my companions. And we had all these wonderful, exciting things on our original itinerary for these 4 days. But when I got mine went down to 4 o'clock that day and nothing else. And 4 o'clock that day, and theirs was still full with all the things. Meeting with His Royal Highness, and that was his grandson. And then nothing else. And I asked my companions, who were all both older, what does this mean? And he said, well, looks like you might be set up, you know. So we went down to breakfast with some people, and I said, well, how old is the prince? And they said, he's 18. Well, when you're 21, someone's 18.
And you're a woman.
He's a senior in high school. I'm a senior in college.
That ain't gonna work.
That's not going to work. A child. That's what I said. He's a child. But when we went, you know, the next day to actually meet him, and he was also a duke. And when we went to actually meet him, he was not a child. He was probably like 27.
Oh, really?
And he was like probably the most handsome man I'd ever seen before. And so it was like, oh gosh, I'm in so much trouble. So at any rate, as life would have it, we ended up, before the story played out, we were engaged. So, yeah.
What was the hardest chapter that you had to write in this book?
was a chapter that I struggle with, and it's a chapter called A Courtyard in Harar. And it's a chapter that takes, it was hard to write because the experience itself, it was based on a real experience that I had. So 30 years after I went back to Ethiopia for the first time, because there was a coup in Ethiopia that ended the relationship. They were imprisoned, the royal family and everything. 30 years later, I went back to Ethiopia, and we went actually to the palace of the Duke of Harar, which would have been our home. And we toured that palace. I was with a group of Stanford alumni travel study club. And it was so hard touring that palace, which would have been our home, and it's now a museum, that emotionally it was just so difficult. And I remember going out to one of the side, like it's probably one of the storage rooms for the cook, and being there and looking out into the courtyard, which was dry, and the palace was shabby, but in my spirit I kind of saw children. I knew they weren't real, but 4 children playing, 4 children playing. And when they looked up, the oldest one, he was about 7, had the face of his father, which would have been my husband. So I knew I was in a strange zone. I knew it was like an imaginary something happening there. And then there was another son, and then there was my daughter, who was my real daughter. She was 3, and then there was a baby in a walker and 2 nurses out there with the children. And so just for that brief moment, I said, I don't know what this is, but I would like to kiss my kids. So it was like, I didn't know what it was, but I just asked, can I? And so it felt like this was an alternate me, because whoever the me was, when I looked down, she was pregnant. So I kind of communicated with her, and she went out and she hugged my oldest son, and she looked him in the eyes, and she kissed his cheek, and she said, I love you. And he said, I love you, Mommy. So I got to do that through her with each of my children that were never born, except for one. And then I said, if only I could see him. And he walked past the door, and he looked out at us, me and the children. And so then, after that experience was over, everything turned back to normal, and it just felt like somewhere in time they lived, like in an alternate universe. They lived, and they had this family, and there was something in me that it felt like it healed. So when I had to write that chapter, the hardest part was writing that intersective moment when both versions of me realized that they were present at the same place. And the younger version felt what the older version of me needed, and she conceded. She stepped back in her spirit and let the older version take over and experience the children. And that was like one of the kindest gestures that I had ever felt.
You sound like you were really at peace there.
It was lovely. It was so sweet. It was so lovely. But the writing of it was so, it was so difficult to catch that moment just right, but I actually did, so.
My sister wanted me to ask you this question. In your view, does this book speak to a cultural imperative and or a spiritual historical journey? Does it?
It does, and I think it speaks to both, because I think the spiritual part, I was just on book tour in Atlanta the week before last, and this group of women that had selected my book back in January to read for September actually flew me out because they were experiencing it, they loved it. And so once we had we were having the talk I was sharing, at the end they had questions, and one of the women said, wait a minute, Sahai, wait a minute. I live a wonderful life, but it's a regular life. So she said, and there's so much magical things, there's so much high spiritual things. I want magic. How do I get magic in my, and so I think that's one of the gifts of the book, is that it takes you on a journey that is both real, but I think on the back it says it's magical realism because it crosses these spiritual lines and I think that's probably the invitation of me and the invitation of the book is that we're more than these bodies, we're more than the circumstances in our life, that we are magical at our core. We're magical, and let us, pick up those magical gifts and use those magical gifts, because I think that is what really will save our lives.
You answered the question I was going to ask, and you just answered it, but are there any future books that you have in your soul that you want to write?
Well, this took me 21 years to do.
My goodness.
And actually, I can say that I've told the story many times, but now that I've written it, the writing is much better than the telling. That there's one of our very prolific writers, Eric Jerome Dyson, said, to me, he read the book and he has a quote on the back, and he said to me, Sahai, this book, you're a writer's writer, because it's just really well written, and so for 21 years I just had this, and Spirit had said to me 2 years in, finish the book is the bridge to the rest of your life. So it's like, I will have to finish this book, because if God said the rest of my life is over here, I have to write a book to do it. I can't imagine not writing it and just thinking, what would that have been like over there and so I did it. And so now I'm in the rest of my life that was divinely created by God. And so, I'm talking to you, and that means you're in it too.
Uh-oh.
This divine.
I want royalty. Last question. If you were to talk to some young authors, and I had you to talk to one in the green room, what would you tell a young author who is trying to write a fiction novel similar to what you're doing?
I would ask them to. I have a feeling that even fiction, like in my case, it's inspired by real events. So usually there's something animating an author from the inside. And probably those are the authors that I would talk to, like somebody that just wants to write a book because I want to write, like, I'm not really the teacher for them, but for ones who something inside of them says to do this, then trust that. First of all, trust that. And then know that, just get out a notebook and just start. Like, what do you already know about this story? And maybe all you know is the title, a working title. Maybe all you know is, yeah, it's going to be about this, it's going to be about this. So just start flushing out and putting on paper what you already know, and you'll be surprised, because it's already living in you, and it wants to come out. And if you don't find a time, and the time could be, when I first started writing the book, I only wrote Wednesday evenings. So you pick the time, Saturday mornings between 6 and 8 a.m., whatever you pick. But once you pick it, be faithful to your writing, because otherwise you will be one of those people who have to write on napkins, because your writing tries to get out whenever it can. But if you give it a place, then it will serve you well. Just sit down, and even if you think you have nothing to write, just honor whatever time you said you devote. Other than that, your writing will be homeless. Yeah, so.
The name of the book is Woven into the Fabric, and the author is Sahai S.E.B. Hayes, or S.E.B. Farrell, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I've been knowing her for eons. That's why I say Hayes instead of Farrell. Thank you so much, S.E.B., for sharing with this audience the fascinating book you have. You ought to go get the book. It's really a fascinating read. And thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you next week with more exciting guests with Conversations with Erroll Parker. Good night. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker.